G'day folks, Ziggy here, and it's time for the final update on my Unleash Arc of Surging Trickster. We started with a 1 Divine budget version, upgraded to 10 Divines, and now the Uncapped Budget, though I aimed for roughly 100 Divines with this. I actually did kind of stick to that budget after selling items from the previous budget tiers, if you ignore that one ring that I went a bit crazy crafting. But even if we call it 150 Divines or hell 200 plus Divines, I could not be happier with this build and how it performed. This is the best Path of Exile build I have personally ever played. It's the best all-rounded and strongest feeling, and the one that carried me through all of the Uber bosses and almost any challenge I could throw at it. The price to performance value ratio on this one is just nuts. I know this because I'm currently working on another new build that I have spent over 340 Divines on so far, and the Arc build is still better at less than half the price. So I'm stoked with this one. It's a masterpiece. And apparently I'm not alone in that feeling as well. You folks seem to have loved the build too, and the comments I've gotten about it have been pretty ecstatic. So here is the final update. The upgrades I made, and the things I fine-tuned, and how it all came together in the end. This build could be taken further of course, but I just feel I didn't need to. It did everything I ever wanted, and then some. If you do decide to take it further, send me your Path of Building sometime. I'd love to see a multi-mirror version of this if anyone puts one together. So first, here's the growth in the Path of Building stats, from 1 Divine on the left with 420k average hit, to 10 Divine in the middle with 1.2 million average hit, and finally the Uncapped Budget or 160 Div one with just under 2.2 million damage per hit. With the improvements to Unleash and Split count in the final version, the damage side of things is actually better than it looks here as well, as we went from 45 million burst in the 10 Div version to 109 million burst damage in the final version. More than doubling the single shot damage and letting the build one-shot guardians and instantly phase some uber bosses. The defensive improvements are even more impressive in my opinion. Effective health pool is kind of a fluff stat, but you can see the real improvements in the max hit stats. From 1 Divine to 10 Divine budget setups, we saw a humble 7.8k Fizz and 20k Elemental grow to a pretty decent 17k Fizz and 35k Elemental average max hits taken. So that's the amount of single hit damage you can take before getting one shot. But in the final version, the uncapped budget version here, we grew to a whopping 60,000 max Fizz hit taken and over 100k for Elemental. I will note too that I'm not just being a PoB warrior here. This is with Frost Shield turned off and no Steel Skin or anything like that, which heavily inflates these stats usually. You'll want to check for that when you're looking at people's PoB builds. And not listed in the stats is the massively improved recovery I also added to the build in this update. So let's talk about that first. Initially my plan when uncapping the budget was to get a Forbidden Flesh and Flame combo with one of the damage options from Assassin to boost DPS. I really didn't feel that was necessary or worthwhile. Most of the Assassin damage options are quite expensive as well. In the end, I went for Spellbreaker in Trickster for 15 Divine total for the set. This gives some more suppression to make gearing easier, and makes suppression way stronger. It also starts your energy shield recharge when you suppress. So that means it's pretty much active all of the time when there are enemy spellcasters around, which is pretty much always. Most things cast spells in this game. To capitalize on this change, we had to do two things. Firstly, we dropped Ghost Reaver. This does make our leech a bit weaker than it was in the previous versions, but it's still insanely good, especially for enabling the full value of the energy leech support on Arc, which is very good support. The second change is a routing change to get Wicked Ward, so that when energy shield recharge starts, it won't stop if we take damage. I actually like this new routing better anyway, because it goes past a very nice crit cluster. Anytime we're getting spammed with spell damage, which is pretty much always in this game, our energy recharge is healing us at a rate of around 1,700 energy shield per second. This is on top of our 1,000 or so leech per second, and that is insane total recovery. What doesn't one-shot us is unlikely to kill us, and we heal back up to max pretty much instantly. And as you saw from the max hit stacks, we're pretty darn resilient to one-shots, so that means it takes a lot to kill this build. This change to add Spellbreaker makes the build extremely comfortable to play as well, which is an important metric for me. It gives a very underrated thing in Path of Exile builds, I think. Healing when not attacking. It's It's all well and good to say that your leech is, you know, near infinite, but when you have to dodge something and there's nothing present to attack, or you're not near the thing you need to attack, well, that's when you die, and that feels very awkward and uncomfortable. So those boss phases where you have to dodge and so on, you really don't want to rely on just leech. Spellbreaker on this build makes it so that spell damage basically actually heals us, no joke. I remember I was doing that annoying Lightning Guardian, and it was like triple whisked and ghosted or something like that, and I was actually running into the ball lightnings in the arena just to heal myself up, intentionally. Now do note that if the Spellbreaker Jewel's price goes up after this video, make sure to note that you can actually buy a set for Soul Drinker or One Step Ahead or Polymath instead, and just change your points around. Buy whichever combo is cheapest. In my recommendation, if you only make one change to the build from the previous versions, then it should be to incorporate Spellbreaker. It is my favourite improvement to the build by far. So next up, gems were some of the big DPS gain upgrades for this one, and the high priority for your next upgrades. Level 21 Arc of Surging combined with level 5 Awakened Added Lightning gives 1 extra split, bringing it to 10 splits total per cast. This doesn't sound like a lot, but when you multiply that by the extra Unleash from level 5 Awakened Unleash, we go from 36 total hits splitting off of Hydrosphere to 50 total hits. That's 14 additional hits, and that's a ton of extra burst damage. So get those 3 gems. Get a level 5 Awakened Added Lightning, even if you can buy it corrupted. That's generally, I think, pretty cheap. Same thing for the Unleash, and get yourself a level 21 Arc of Surging. For auras at this point, I got a corrupted level 3 Enlighten gem, actually pretty cheap at only 3 divine, because there's so many people failing. And then I dropped Herald of Ice for Zealotry. This gives more consistent crits and better damage overall, and Herald of Ice was mostly for AoE clear boosting, while leveling in the lower level maps anyway. It doesn't do a lot in bossing or higher end content. I ended up dropping Vaal Arc. Level 21 Vaal Arc of Surging is an option, but it's simply too expensive, and I didn't really need it in the end after my next purchase, which was Oriath's End. This flask is pretty pricey at around 20 divines, but it's a big clear booster for dense content. It is only needed for AoE clear though. You can do without it entirely, especially if you only really plan on doing like Guardian rushing or essences or boss farming. You don't really need it at all if you're doing that content. I swap it out for a Ruby or Topaz flask when bossing, whatever is appropriate. Another big DPS upgrade for the build was to improve from a Replica Duadri's ring, which is very solid for its price, to a Manifold ring with damage per power and frenzy charge mods. I got actually quite lucky when trying to craft my ring here, so I ended up spending way too much trying to perfect the ring with Hinakora's locks and stuff like that, as you may have seen in my ring crafting video. But the basic version of this ring is actually very affordable within this budget tier. Depending on how much the bases have gone up, if there are a few div now, it might be something like a 5 to 10 div craft possibly. If Manifold Ring prices go up too much, then compare the price to power ratio you can get with a craft like that too, instead maybe saving up for a +1 charge ring in the long term. It's really not necessary, and you can stick with the Replica Duadri's ring for a very long time. I think in the end I got about 20-something% more damage from the ring. Now in this uncapped budget life, we can start fishing for good corruptions too on our gear. And we have some nice items to corrupt as well this league. I got a Malachai's Loop with Fizz taken as cold. That's an excellent mod, but Fizz taken as chaos is even better. For Ralikesh, I got Suppression to free up a suffix. Move speed or plus levels to AoE cursor auras, all excellent options too if you just socket the relevant gems inside of them to gain some extra power. For the Graven's Belt, I got move speed under Flask Effect to improve mobility, but Crit Multi, Increased Intelligence, or Wrath Effect are all very good options as well. Finally, for the Anathema Ring, I got cold damage to spells. When you drop Herald of Ice, you may end up with no cold damage, which means no shatters and no chill with minimum chill effect charms, which are very nice. This ring corruption solves both problems by just giving you some cold damage. You don't need a lot. Speaking of charms, I opted to offload a lot of resistances and actually suppression to charms, which made gearing way nicer. Suppression prevention on full ES is also very good in this build too, as we're always full. Curse effect is very strong, and make sure to get a Culling Strike source always in pretty much any build. Charms are an easy way to get one. A pro tip for Atziri in the feared fights, get a charm with Reflect immunity to just swap in just for those fights, or Reflect maps. I also got suppression and resists on my That Which Was Taken jewel, along with chill as a bonus. That minimum chill thing is quite nice as long as you have at least 1 point of cold damage. Ignore the reflect mod as that's not actually reliable enough unless you overcap crit. That Which Was Taken and charms are great problem solver slots, and that's how I treated them. Make sure to check the notes section in the Path of Building for trade search links for charms and other things. I didn't actually end up changing my body armor from the 10 div version, but I did make a video on how to craft them reliably as the price on them went up, since it is basically a crafted item only. It's actually very easy to craft one of these. It was quite profitable for me to do as well. So make sure to check that video out to learn how. What I did change was my helmet though. I spent quite a bit on this to get Fizz taken as Chaos. 37 divines this one cost me. These only drop in Delve, so that's why they're quite pricey, and they're basically a best in slot for defenses for CI builds. You can get Fizz taken as cold versions instead, or even other elements for much cheaper. Coupling either option with a Fizz taken as Chaos, Eldritch implicit, gives a ton of Fizz mitigation on this character, and is well worth the investment. And that pretty much covers it for the upgrades, apart from some minor stuff like qualitying and corrupting gems and, you know, that sort of fluff stuff you do eventually. It was mostly just a few big, chunky, but very, very impactful upgrades, and that was quite fun to do. That took us from the 10 div to the 100-ish div tier budget, and saw a huge growth in power. So next, I will cover some frequently asked questions and some other tips. Firstly, the Arcanist brand curses. It just deletes your mana pool. It was kind of tolerable in the previous setups with Herald of Ice in a bit more open manner, but with the tighter reservation when we swapped to Enhance and Zealotry, I found myself just not using the Arcanist brand because it would deplete my mana and I couldn't cast Arc or Flame Dash reliably. Simply changing to Bane to cast Enfeeble, Tempt Chains, and Punishment was a huge improvement to the build. It has a little bit of reduced curse effect, but it's well worth it to actually be able to use the curses without any mana issues. I use Hex Touch on Hydrosphere for the damage curses, early weakness and conductivity, since you're wanting to expose enemies with it anyway, so it's kind of perfect. And I opted to manually cast Assassin's Mark, as it has infinite duration, and you only really need to cast it on bosses or very tough, juiced up rares. Manually casting this allows you to fit an extra curse in the build effectively. When it comes to curses and stuff like this, go with what's comfortable for you though, but this is my suggested setup. Now, some people struggle a bit with Hydrosphere. I have had quite a lot of questions on it, and I did struggle with it too at first. Here's some things you need to know. Firstly, make sure that you're not accidentally hitting it with something else that's triggering its cooldown. A lot of people were using Herald of Thunder early on. This triggers it and will cause you to feel like you're missing. Secondly, don't place it on top of or behind the boss. Auto-targeting prioritizes bosses, so if they're too close together, it will go for the boss instead. You want to place Hydrosphere between you and the boss, or off to the side, or even behind you, and it can still change them if it's close enough. It has a pretty good range on it, about half a screen radius, so you'll get a feel for that over time. What I like to do is place the Hydrosphere behind the boss on the other side of them, and then draw it through either off to the side or between me and them to hit them with the Hex Touch and to expose them and to put my Hydrosphere in an optimal position, and then I arc it. The next thing is don't spam cast. This is probably the biggest issue most people fall into, because that's how you play 99% of builds in Path of Exile. You spam cast. That's not how you play this build. If you spam, you will hit or split to the Hydrosphere and trigger its cooldown, which makes it untargetable for 1 second. This makes it feel like you're missing. You're not actually missing, it's just on cooldown. Remember that this is a burst damage Unleash build. Imagine you're like a sniper waiting for the perfect shot, right? You want to go for that one shot, one kill. Dodge, position, curse the enemy, and then unleash. Reposition yourself, and then your Hydrosphere, wait, and then unleash again. It's quite different to most builds that want to maximize DPS uptime, and it can take a bit to wrap your head around that. It's actually a really fun alternative playstyle once you get that feeling and that rhythm down. It'll start to become second nature, your unleash timings as well. You don't have to perfectly optimize it, but you want to wait for most of your stacks, and you want to wait to position your Hydrosphere and for it to come off cooldown. The timings are not tight here, but you do need to, wait, go for that big shot. Once you get the feel from it and wrap your head around that change of pace or change of build style, you'll actually start to realize that Hydrosphere and Unleash are real strengths of the build to be used. Hydrosphere actually lets you chain arc to bosses off screen and on the other side of an arena. You barely even need to know where the boss is. This is great for like the final phase of Maven, for example, or SIRUS with how much he teleports around. You don't even really need to keep track of them a lot of the time. You can just kind of throw the Hydrosphere towards the middle of the arena in their general direction. And Unleash as well. It lets you focus on dodging and then just like mega beam the boss whenever you feel it's safe to do so. At first I felt like Hydrosphere was clunky and erratic, but now, after playing with it for quite a while, it's like second nature, and I actually really appreciate those upsides. And the last thing I want to talk about here is what content you should play this build in. And to tangent for a second, this is probably the most overlooked aspect of build refinement in Path of Exile. Matching the right content to the right build will make your builds feel way, way better. And playing a build in the wrong content, even a really good build, will make it feel like garbage. This arc build gets worse the more enemies there are, unless they die instantly. This is a key piece of information for this build. The more enemies that survive a cast of arc, the more your damage is split up on future casts, right? So 100% Delirium, Wisp Juicing, Simulacrums, and even things like Flawless Breach Stones are kind of bad content for this build, and they make the build feel bad. Oriath's End or things like Impulses that do explosions can help a lot, but it's still really not the right content for the build, right? If you want to excel at those types of high density, really cluttery content, then you want something with like infinite piercing, or something that's really explosion focused, or something that actually ramps with the more enemies, like my Mamba Strike build. What Unleash Arc excels at and feels god tier while doing is content with fewer, tougher enemies. Uber bosses, essences, guardian bosses, boss rushing strats, the feared, Maven witnessing bosses, sanctums, and even some medium density content like Legion it actually works really well in as well. You play this sort of content on the build, and you're gonna have a good time. Overall, I love this build, and I loved sharing it with you folks. I might try to do this style of like budget tiered build content in future leagues as well too, since it had quite a good response and it was pretty fun to do. If you have any final questions about the build, then let me know in the comments below. Or if you just want to share your experience, I feed off of feedback, so thank you for that. That's it for now, I'm Ziggy D, and thanks for watching.